Thanks for joining us on the DDS Faith Podcast. Our prayer is that as we discuss what God has to teach us through His Word, we can all learn how to deepen, defend, and share our faith in Jesus Christ.
So let's wrap up the discipleship series. The most important aspect of discipleship that we are given biblically being the family discipleship model, and the commandment that parents have to train up their children in the ways of the Lord. Unfortunately, this is often neglected. I've seen that around me growing up, how neglected this aspect of discipleship is, and honestly it's really unfortunate because that's the way it is designed, and there's good reason for that we'll get into, but it looks like you had something to say.
So you said family discipleship model. So really the main point of this is for us to understand whose responsibility is it to make disciples. So a lot of people, and as a youth pastor, I get this all the time, but I would have parents come in and essentially they would outsource their requirement to disciple their kids, and they would outsource it to me, one of the pastors. Which, does a youth pastor or a pastor make disciples? Yes. But is it their job to make all of the disciples? No, absolutely not. That's everybody's job. Go ahead.
Well, and like you just said, there's a difference between, like you making disciples as a youth pastor versus you being those students' primary disciple maker. Because in their life, you are not their primary disciple maker.
Right.
It's their parents.
It should be the parents.
And so, unfortunately, the way we do church now, and I'm generally speaking here, is that we gather all of the students into a Wednesday night or a Sunday night service that's just middle and high school. And we essentially throw them to the youth pastor so that the youth pastor can raise these children spiritually, while the dads and the moms teach them about how to drive a vehicle and how to kill a deer and how to, obey the law. The youth pastor teaches them the ways of the Lord and the Bible and disciples them spiritually.
And
that's not how it should be.
Under an hour once a week.
Under an hour?
Yeah, under an hour once a week. That's it. And so now, given this strategy that we take as a church, now we have this subculture of students in the church that are having their own separate church. And so now, not only do we have parents that aren't discipling their children, but we have a massive divide between the students of the church and the adults of the church.
Right.
So now, the students are quote, worshiping how they want to. They're doing the songs they want to. They're playing games, all this stuff. And when it's time to graduate, now they got to go to, quote, big church. Mm-hmm. And so that doesn't merge well because they don't know any of these people because they've had their own sub-church this whole time. So now we have to make a college ministry.
That's why it was important to me when I did worship ministry at any of the church I was in. I always wanted to include as many students as I could in the worship team, whatever ensemble, choir we had, so that they were part. It wasn't the adult choir. It was the church choir,
Right.
Mm-hmm.
and the church included people of all ages.
I think that's a great thing too. But so now not only do we have parents that aren't discipling their children now, but we have this little subculture of a church and a youth group. So now when they graduate, they have to go to big church. That doesn't work very well because that doesn't mix with the style that they had going on. So now we have to create a college group. Now they're in the college group for the next 4 years, and now that's not enough. So now we have a college and career group, and it just keeps going and keeps going. So we have parents that aren't discipling their children, and we have these little subcultures of churches that have their own styles spread across every generation in this church, and that's not the biblical model for how discipleship should be. And when you neglect the family discipleship model that is biblical and is a commandment that we have, then there's a lot of problems that can come out of this, such as, one, you're almost building superficial Christians in a sense, because when you're home, it's awkward to have these conversations with your family. But one of these days, the only time you're going to be able to have these conversations is in your home. We often, like COVID, for example.
Right.
That I think the church failed that test pretty miserably.
Miserably.
You looked like you had to say something.
Yeah. So this is just something that I do with my family. Excuse me. So after being a youth pastor for 10 years, and you see this, like you said, this subgroup, this sub church almost that you get with the youth. And then, they kind of sprinkle them into the big service, or they got children's church, and it's just like, okay, they're over there, and it's like, it's the parent's job to teach that child how to sit in service and how to make disciples. And, with my kids, we sit them down. And actually, the church that I go to, we sit them down, we talk to them. But the church that I go to, when they do the Lord's Supper, they specifically say, if your child is not saved, do not let them partake in this. And then they say, use it as an opportunity for discipleship, to share the gospel with them. Mm-hmm. And we do that with our kids all the time. It's wonderful because they ask questions. They're in the service and they see mom and dad go and, take the wine and the bread, but they don't get to. Well, why not? Well, then we explain that to them. Or we don't make decisions without praying, and our kids see us do that.
Well, the outsourcing that you mentioned earlier, that really starts at birth, really.
Yeah.
I mean, there's children's church now. So it is possible that a child doesn't sit in the corporate worship service until he's in middle school.
Yeah,
or
some
high
people
school.
it's middle school. It's just crazy.
At least, in most cases, at least middle school.
And
See, I don't ever remember, and I'm the old one, so, back in the day for me, would that be the 80s, but I never went to children's church. We were in the worship service, and, we got the fingernails in the leg every once in a while.
The little mom pinch.
Yeah.
Well, I get it because, and it becomes a root problem with the church today, is it's so much about the service and entertainment and making sure everybody's comfortable and making sure nobody feels awkward. They take the children out of the church because then, you don't have crying babies. You don't have kids that are fussing and wanting to play with toys and, whatever. Right. So it's incredibly convenient to just take the kids out of the church.
And so then when that kid reaches middle school, and let's say, they've never been in a worship service, and all of a sudden, you can't go to children's church anymore. You have to go to, quote unquote, big church. Well, I don't know what they're doing in there and how they're supposed to behave.
And they don't like it.
And they don't like it. They're bored.
Yep.
I'm all for children being in the service. Now, if you have like a 3-month-old infant, they're probably not going to get much out of the service.
Right.
But once your child gets to, the age of 2 or 3 years old and they can start retaining memory, if they see, especially their father, in a setting where it is obvious that someone or something is higher than them, so God in this example, they're going to see that and they're going to notice that and they're going to remember it, versus if they never see their parents worship in a corporate setting. Now, I'm not saying you have to drag your kids to all your Bible studies and things like that, but it is important that they see you worship and that you're that model. This is quoted a lot for a lot of discipleship models in the Bible. Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and all your mind, all your might. Need my glasses. These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. Verse 7, you shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Notice that part right in the middle there about sitting down with your children and having those conversations, being intentional about that, and literally binding the words of the Lord around your neck. Well, I mean, not literally, but I mean, they're there. Like, you should always be acknowledging them and obeying them and being doers of it. And that, like, your children are your primary disciples, or they should be. And it's not the youth pastor's job to raise your children.
Well, you pulled a verse out of the Old Testament, and I think there's a lot of Christians out there that they see the Old Testament like, that's the Old Testament. And I know we've discussed this before. If you see Christianity as just a completion of Judaism, it's Judaism, but with the Messiah that's already come.
Right.
If you look at it that way, it makes a whole lot more sense, and it makes a much stronger argument for Christianity. Mm-hmm. Now, looking at the Old Testament, we see a lot of those things. You're like, oh, well, we don't follow all those laws, so should we? And da-da-da-da-da, and we can come into that another day. But, I do believe that the Old Testament sets up so many great things that we see in the New Testament and that we see in the church today of the way it should look. From the very beginning, God was always about discipleship. He tells them all, he says, teach them, show them how to do this. That was Adam. His responsibility was to teach Eve what God had taught them, and they're supposed to teach their kids and pass down. Now think about it. How did they pass down everything with Adam and Eve and Noah and Abraham and all that? By word of mouth. They talked about it all the time. They sat around. They said, now let me tell you the story about Abraham. Let me tell you about your great-great-grandfather Abraham. Or your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great Adam, And that's the way we should be looking at Scripture. Number one, as a whole, but also we need to examine it for our own lives. And if you look at the whole part of the Old Testament and the New Testament, you look at it all together, it just makes so much more sense.
Well, none of the the New Testament is almost like a commentary of the Old Testament in a sense. Like it try and read Romans or Hebrews without the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. You can't do that.
Right.
It makes no sense. And like you reminded me of something. Like you mentioned Abraham. If you look back and like somewhere around like Genesis, maybe like 24 or 25, Abraham sends one of his servants to go find Isaac a wife. Like, why is that any of Abraham's business, right? So Abraham's servant goes and, has the camels and is at the water well and is like, the Lord says, the first one to come and offer, water to your camels and da-da-da. I'm really paraphrasing. That's the one that should be Isaac's wife.
Yeah,
so
which translation has the da-da-da?
So Abraham's servant comes back to Abraham with Rebekah, and that's Isaac's wife that he takes and consummates and things like that. But anyways, why is that any of Abraham's business? He's just Isaac's dad. And this is post Isaac's sacrifice to the Lord.
Yeah.
So like, why is that
Abraham sacrificing?
Right.
But that's how it should be. Like, whenever Abraham's servant brought back Rebekah for Isaac, the first thing he did was drop down and worship the Lord. Like, that's how much he cared about Isaac, his Isaac taking a wife. And really, in today's age, we would be like, why does it's not Abraham's decision,
Yeah.
He's just the father. But that's the Old Testament. So this also came to mind, Ephesians 6. Again, this is one of those unfortunate chapter breaks because in chapter 5 it's talking about the role of husband and wife.
Yep.
And then in chapter 6 it gets into the children. So keep that in mind about how we already did the father's role and the wife's role. Chapter 6, verse 1, Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Quotes the Old Testament. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise. I'll address that in a second. So that it may be well with you and that you may long live on the earth. So what it means by that, like the first commandment with a promise. So that's the fifth commandment given. The first four commandments are all regarding like God. So like, don't have any other gods, don't make idols, don't take God's name in vain, and honor the Sabbath. Then the very first commandment that's not regarding like directly about God is honor your father and mother. And then right after Paul addresses that in Ephesians 6, verse 4, he says, Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. I mean, I feel like that speaks for itself.
Yeah, it does. But, I think a lot of people just read over that and they're just like, oh, children, obey your parents. Okay, I'm supposed to teach them to be
kids
a man. Good morals.
Yeah.
And that was one of the big things in teaching in churches and whatnot. They're like, you need to teach our kids good morals, and you need to teach our kids about depression and all that stuff. And I'm like, yeah, I am, but not directly. I'm showing them Christ, and in showing them Christ, they will learn morality. They will learn how to overcome depression, and we would talk about things like that. Mental health is incredibly important, especially in the Christian realm, because there's a lot of people that are just like, how could you be filled with the Holy Spirit and be depressed? It happens. It absolutely happens, and we'll talk about that another day. But you have so many parents that they outsource all of their kids' education. They send them to public school. They send them to church. Except for public schools got them 5 days a week for 8 hours a day. And
1,400 instructional hours.
If they're there all the time, I might have them 5 hours a week.
If that, that's still a stretch.
That's a real big stretch.
Yeah. Well, how many of those 5 hours are actual teaching?
Exactly.
Right, because I think it's 14,000 instructional hours between kindergarten and 12th grade. So when you're sending, I don't want to go down this route too hard, but it kind of fits. When you're sending your children to public school, and I already have my opinions on this, if your child asks, let's say their teacher, has an
opinion on anything,
if your child asks his or her teacher, why do I need to learn how to read? Their response is going to be, so you can read road signs and read menus and all that stuff, which is important. Don't get me wrong. Like, you need to be a decent citizen. You got to be able to at least read the road signs and menus. And things like that. So that answer is already conforming them to the image of our culture. That's already getting them down this road. And I really don't know how to describe it. But if your child asks you, the parent, why it's important to them to read, you should say, because one of the main reasons, one of the main ways God communicates with us is through his written word. That's the number one reason why you should learn how to read. All these other things will fall into place. So when you're sending your child to be raised by a secular education system, you're already taking them out of your hands. And, maybe I've heard a lot of people say, well, they're just learning like just math and literature and things like that. But they're still, what if they're going to be the salt and light of the earth? You can't take all the Christians out of the public school. But again, that's not the purpose, because if you look at the context of the salt and light of the earth, it also says that essentially the useless salt can just be thrown onto the ground and trampled over with your feet. So are they really salt and light of the earth if they're spending that much time in public school and not under your own instruction?
Well, so on that, part of that is going to have to be understood with our culture. And there's a lot of things that would almost be impossible to change. So like, most parents work, a lot of households, both parents work, and taking them to private school is expensive, and even homeschool is expensive. And if you're having to work, that makes it even more difficult. So, public school has its place. But I think that we can have our kids in public school and still train them in the way they should go.
For me, for example, I grew up, and now I'm learning the Bible under the presuppositions that I was taught growing up between secular school and a Southern Baptist church. It's hard to get rid of a lot of those presuppositions. And it almost, in a sense, warps the way you study the Bible when you're raised in that sense.
Well, even your culture is raising as an American messes up how you read the Bible.
Oh yeah, and it's hard to get rid of those presuppositions. Like, it's nearly impossible. But when you're neglecting the responsibility to raise up your children in the instruction and discipline of the Lord and disciple them,
that I can agree with. I can agree with that. You should not neglect it, but there are so many more complications that come into parenting. And I don't want a parent to think, oh man, if I don't put my kids in private school or homeschool, then I'm just a bad Christian, because that's not the case. But I do think you need to be more careful. Yeah. Like with our kids with cussing. We don't let our kids cuss. We tell them, hey, it's wrong. So you can shelter the child and not show them anything, but then they're going to go to school and they're going to hear it anyway, right? Now, I'm not saying you should shower them with it or anything, by no means, but when we do come across that cuss word, or they have a friend that cusses or does something like that, what we do is we explain to our children, hey, listen, that's what they're doing and that's their choice and that's fine, but we don't act that way. Don't judge somebody and put them down because they're choosing to live their life that way. That's on them.
I served with a pastor in Knoxville who actually stood in the pulpit on Mother's Day and told every mother in that congregation if they sent their child to a public school, they were bad mothers.
Ugh.
And I went to public school, but I was also in church regularly.
Right.
And during those Wednesday night, Sunday night discipleship training, whatever you want to call it, we were told, hey, that's your mission field. The people you pass in the hallway, people at the locker next to you probably don't believe the way you believe. And I had people at school tell me, that I was different because I didn't go out and party and cruise up and down Main Street. I had no desire to do that stuff. So I think there is an opportunity there for evangelism, mission, sharing your faith. I just get almost like a cringe, creepy, we're told to be in the world, not of the world. But I think there is such a thing where you can be this is the same pastor who on a Wednesday night, the kids, we just happened to have a spontaneous discussion about alcoholism and drugs. And because there were some kids that were, they had friends that were dealing with that actually. And that was it came up organically. We talked about it and I got in trouble because he had...
Because he wanted to shelter his kids, which is a problem.
And I said, I've got all these other kids that spend their week in public school being surrounded by this. I can't help it if you're sheltering yours from the real world.
Right.
So, I get the whole homeschool thing. It's probably not a very realistic thing for a lot because people work.
Yeah. And it's got to work for the kids too.
Right.
It doesn't work for my daughter. She's too much of a social butterfly, and another thing on that, the whole private and just not public school, private school or homeschool. If you're just sending your kids to private school and you're outsourcing discipleship to them as well, you still have a problem.
Agreed.
It's the same problem.
Yeah, you have to attack the root.
Homeschool is great. There's a lot of advantages. There's a lot of disadvantages too. It's hard to weigh to objectively say, homeschool is bad or homeschool is good or public school is bad or whatever. But, I think we need to be careful, taking hard stances like that. Anybody that's a parent, guys, it's complicated. I'm a parent. I got 3 and it's a tough job. And Katie and I, my wife, we have done public school, we have done homeschool, and we're going to try private school. We're going to give it a shot and see how it goes. I'm sure there'll be plenty of things that, the point of this episode is not, you should do homeschool or you should do this or you should do that.
Yeah, I don't want to get us sidetracked.
It's not that. The point and the purpose of this episode is to say, don't outsource your responsibilities of discipling your children. So if they go to private school or they go to church and they have bad theology, what do? You're like, oh, well, he's the pastor, Like, no, you are responsible as the parent. Doesn't mean you have to do it all, but you're responsible. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking back while you were talking. I was paying attention, kind of.
Sure.
But we talked about earlier having your children in the worship service itself, or not children's church. And I was just sitting here thinking, in the worship service, that's where I saw my parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles serve. I had an uncle who was the worship leader.
Yeah.
Watched him lead worship every week. My dad, granddad, they were deacons, so they would serve Lord's Supper, and they would tell us about that
Yeah.
before we went to the service at home. Like, hey, we're going to have Lord's Supper today. Kind of what they do at the church that you were going to.
Yeah.
My mom sang solos every once in a while. That's ingrained in me, is watching my family model service to the Lord in the church.
Yeah.
So much so.
Modeled worship.
Right. A friend of mine was interviewing Sandy Patty on his podcast. Now, she was who's that? She was a popular Christian artist. Was very popular back in the 80s when I was a child, and my mom sang a lot of her songs in church. So my friend was interviewing her on his podcast, and he played a little 20-second clip of a song that was one of her most popular songs. And as soon as it started, I flashed back, and I saw my mom standing there singing that exact same song. So
That's awesome.
So having the kids in the service is a great opportunity for them to see service and worship being modeled for them, rather than just stick them in children's church where they color
Just
and then have a
babysit.
little 5-minute. We had the flannel boards in Sunday school. Now I'm assuming they did it in children's church too.
I don't
but-
know what a flannel board is.
Oh, you don't know what a flannel board is?
I know what flannel is.
Okay, you need that. I'm not going to go
It's
into
the
all
thing
that.
that Eli hasn't worn in a while.
It's not that time of year.
Oh,
Just
is it
YouTube that.
time
That
of year?
was
Okay.
that was a big, and again back in the '80s before video, internet, and all phones. They pull out the flannel board, and you're in for it. Okay, we're going to have like an actual, just YouTube flannel board. I'm not going to get into it.
All right. We have all these different groups and almost divisions in the church, and we create them. One of the ways we create them is by age, and we will do. Most churches, your Sunday schools probably look like this. You've got your children, which they're broken up depending on how many kids you have. Maybe kindergarten first, second, third, fourth, fifth.
Yeah,
And then-
usually the children and the youth are done by school age.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you hit adult.
Yeah, and then you hit adults, and then it's like, okay, we got our college and career, like you were talking about. We're gonna 18 to 30 or 29. And then you got your young adults, so or whatever. I don't know what
The
they're called.
newlyweds.
One.
The 30 to 40 or newlyweds or just senior class or whatever. Like, we literally divide the church.
Right.
Show me in the Bible age segregated
Yeah.
services.
Yeah.
That's
What-
not a thing.
What I like at the church I'm at now, but they essentially have classes, and you can sign up for whatever you want. This one's talking about, I don't know, apologetics. This one's going through Nehemiah. This one's going through James. This one's going through the book Radical by David Platt, or whatever. Or they talk about family discipleship or evangelism, spiritual disciplines. Like, they have all these different things, and you can pick. And guess what? Most of them don't last longer than 8 weeks.
And they're not age segregated.
Yep.
Some of them
Anybody
are.
can go.
Some of them are gender segregated, but you do
Right.
see that in the Bible. That I can point that out.
And I just think it's hilarious the last few years when the subject of small groups has come up. It scares people. They're like, no, we can't
You can't get rid of Sunday school. It's like in the Bible,
no,
man.
Just the thought of small groups.
You didn't read
in
First Sunday
general.
Schools?
Huh?
You didn't read First Sunday Schools by Paul?
No. But like, they don't like the term small group. But I'm like, have you read the definition of small group? Because you're in one every Sunday morning.
Yeah.
You just call it a Sunday school class.
Right.
It's the truth.
I'm seriously to the point where, like, with youth groups or college groups or whatever, if parents are neglecting their job to disciple their children, and now we have subcultures of church that's separated, age segregated from the rest of the church, abolish it.
You almost need to get rid of
Literally
it. Because
get rid of it.
It was, I think the intention behind it was good, but I think ultimately it has made everyone lazy in discipling their
Absolutely.
kids.
I'm seriously to the point where I would say let's abolish youth
back
group.
on.
When I was in high school, I never was part of a church youth group. We attended services on Sundays. Now, When I would go and spend summers with my grandparents, the youth pastor there was always trying to include me with things. But see, I didn't go to school
Right.
with those kids. So I would go and participate, but I never really did
Yeah.
fit in with that. But I was never part of a youth group growing up. I mean, my parents and grandparents, set me down or set all of us down,
Yeah. Well, you can read books, and I did my
I'm saved, but,
yeah
I
my
didn't go to a youth group.
right my
What?
doctoral
You aren't
research.
saved then.
My doctoral research was
Said
actually
I am saved.
No, if you didn't go to a youth group, then you're not.
yeah
Oh.
can't be saved. No. My doctoral research was actually on this, and one of the big things was, and actually Ken Ham talks about it quite a bit. I think it's called Already Gone, and basically it's under the idea that by the time they get to 7th and 8th grade, that child is already gone. That though they are still in church, they've left the building. They don't want to be there. They're not really fitting in. And he had a different conclusion than I made, because I had some different research. But the conclusion that I made, because I was, why are kids, when they turn 18, they graduate high school, most of them don't come back. Like 2 out of 3 don't come back.
Well, for me, my experience was once they got their driver's license.
Yeah,
And then they had the option of,
Yes.
now mama and daddy's not forcing me
Yeah.
to come. I can drive myself if I want to go.
Exactly. So the part of the research was on that, and I was like, how important are parents? Which parents are huge role, huge role. But do you know what keeps them there? It's not
Pizza.
that. Yes.
Dodgeball.
If you're how you get them there is how you're gonna have to keep them there. If you gotta if you gotta get them to church by feeding them and getting them food and giving them pizza and snacks and this particular song and that particular song and this preacher and all this, if you're having to do that, you're gonna have to keep doing that to keep them there, because otherwise they're gonna leave. How you get them there is how you're gonna have to keep them there. And what I learned, and the result in this research that I did. I'm not going to get on all the boring stuff, but it's essentially the conclusion was that if they will find somebody within the church where they can build more than a superficial relationship with them. So, most of the like, oh, guys, we got a fellowship and stuff, and it's like, yeah, let's do a cookout. There's nothing wrong with a cookout. Cookouts are great. They're fantastic. But the majority of our fellowship should be in the Word. And we should be digging into doctrine. We should sound doctrine. We should be looking in to scriptures, and we should challenge each other. And when youth do that to one another, they're more likely to stick with church.
Well, fellowship starts in the Word.
Yeah.
No,
it doesn't. Starts over a potluck.
yeah, that's true. Yeah. Or Lake Day.
Yeah, there you go. Like that.
But I want to explain a little bit more about my whole let's abolish youth ministry thing, because I don't want that to sound like I'm.
Yeah, I think
Hey,
you should.
are you kidding me?
You might need a camp on that.
Yeah,
a little
I
bit.
want to explain that, because I know it sounds harsh.
Just so you know, with getting rid of youth ministry, children's ministry, stuff like that, that's actually Ken Ham's conclusion in his book Already Gone.
Well, and
which I sort of agree.
well, I want to. I'm not saying. Well, let me just clarify this.
As it is now, it should go
Right.
away. It could be done right.
I would say that generally speaking, in most churches in this area, we've gotten to the point where they need to go. I'm not objectively saying that. It's like you just said. If we've
You're not
gotten to this
absolutely
point,
saying that,
right?
Make it an absolute statement.
Right. So here's my thing. I'm not against, let's say, youth of the general age of, middle school and high school boys meeting for a Bible study or having their own worship service. I'm not against that. However, if it has gotten to the point where it is a subculture and they're now worshiping this style and they can't segregate or integrate with the rest of the church and seek wise counsel and be discipled by other people, now it's a problem. Two, go ahead.
Go. You're fine.
Two, and the biggest thing here is parents are now neglecting discipling their children. Now, Eli, if you abolish youth groups, what about the kids that don't have parents that are discipling them? Well, the problem is that, okay, so you can say that. So now let's get all these kids in here that parents aren't discipling them. Now you're giving these parents an excuse. I mean, you're just playing into the problem at this point. It's like, well, these people are, they're way too overweight. They're morbidly obese, but they haven't had a meal today. So let's give them a big old potluck dinner. Now you're just giving into the problem. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
How about we implement a program to train parents on how to disciple their children, thus getting at the biblical root of how it should be done and not giving them a platform that feeds into the problem that's already there.
Well,
Okay, let me throw this one at
yeah,
you.
go ahead.
You see what I'm saying?
That's exactly what you're saying. What do you do with the student who's saved, but mom and dad aren't and have no interest in discipleship? And
Well, that's
when
when
he
I
doesn't
think
have any discipleship at home. His parents aren't doing it.
that's a good question. That's when I think that we should be meeting in homes a lot. And in a sense, parents should be ready to take in those children. And now they're like, okay, it's like Paul. Paul was not Timothy's genetic father, but he was his spiritual father. So Paul disciples Timothy. He wrote him several letters, instructed them on how to do things, but he was not his genetic father. So I think in that case, when you have a child that's parents are neglecting that discipleship, I'm not a parent, but parents should be willing to take in these children and disciple them, and hopefully, also be evangelizing to that person's parents.
Right.
Well, if the church is going to do any sort of particular ministry, it should be for a discipleship ministry where you have people that are trained to help these younger people that don't have parents that'll disciple them, and then they make a disciple that way.
And at the church we're going to, they have a family discipleship plan that you can follow. And
if you need
they
help, 'cause,
constantly, like every Sunday, they're like,
Yep.
talk to your kids on the way home about this.
Well, you may not.
And-
A lot of people may not feel equipped. They're like, I just don't know enough about the Bible. What if I say something wrong? What if I leave my kid wrong? I mean, I get that. Those are all genuine,
Well,
understandable
you should ask
fears.
those questions. So you should never just,
Yeah. But your kids need to see you struggle. Your kids need to see you fail, and your kids need to see you not know something.
And if your kid asks you a question that you don't know, and they hear you respond with, let's go to the Bible, that will speak more volumes than you spitting out an answer to them.
Yep.
If you can reconcile their question back to God's word, that speaks volumes. And
Exactly.
the discipleship starts in the home with parents, and when we neglect that and we build a subculture of worship style that's now age segregated, cut it out. It needs to go, because that's why we have so many. We have youth groups, and I've also seen youth groups that are now divided into middle school and high school. Now we have the college group. Now we have the college and career. Now we have the newlyweds and the young adults. It's all age segregated, and not only that, but think about how much money youth ministry brings in. We got. I mean, there's more youth bands than there are youth groups at this point. Like, there's traveling youth bands that go there making money.
Well, I remember being in church, and the youth would go to camp for a week, and then they would come back and they would have to give a report to the church body, and they would want to sing a couple of the songs that they would do at camp. And I just remember one year there was a drum set sitting up on the platform, and one of the little old ladies came in, saw the drum set on the stage, turned around, left, got in her car, and went home. So there's this divide, and which was all, again, it was like, for
It's
me,
like the young don't like what you're doing, and the old don't like what they're doing.
right. So that's why it was important for me to bring them in and have them be part of the music ministry. Middle school, high school, adult. So you see all those ages on the platform playing an instrument, singing, doing something.
That's how it should be done.
The small group that I'm involved in at my church, my wife and I, we sit together, and we sit at this round table, and there are about 4 other ladies that are easily twice my age. Easily twice my age.
But they are awesome, though.
And they're awesome. They're real fun, and I know that in the past when I've had youth ministries and whatnot, it's so separated. It's like you got the young and the old, and you better keep them separated, or else you're going to be in trouble. And like I remember, I had youth that were always so scared to be around some of the adults because they didn't know how to act around them.
Right.
But those adults should be pouring in to the youth and the children and making disciples out of them and actually teaching them things. Take one under your wing and talk with them and stuff.
And so like she left and was not even interested in what the Lord had done in those kids' lives that week.
Yeah.
She just knew there was a drum set, so somebody's going to be playing drums, and she wasn't staying for it. And I thought, wow,
and that
how
just goes back
selfish.
to and that's not even age segregation at that point. It's just style segregation.
Right.
The youth likes this, and the adults like this.
My
and so it's
experience has always
separated.
been, though, the youth always assimilate. Is that the word?
It's funny because this actually happened at one of the churches that I was at. The youth actually came up to me and it was like, why won't they let us play our music? They're asking us to play, but they want us to sing a bunch of hymns.
Right.
And like, we don't complain when they do hymns all the time. Like,
yeah,
but
why are they complaining on this one time that we want to do our contemporary stuff?
I never got one anonymous note from a youth or child saying, why don't we sing more Hillsong or whatever the popular thing is? But I got plenty from, we need to sing more hymns.
Gosh. And you were very, very blended. I thought you did a very good job of blending the service. You had your contemporary and you had your hymns, and then you had the ones that were combined.
Right.
Those are good.
Well, it was, I always said, the church needed to be reminded God is still inspiring songwriters. He did not stop with Bill Gaither. Bill Gaither was not the last divinely inspired composer. But for me, my goal was always, I want the whole body to worship together.
Yes.
Not like, okay, we're going to do this song, so everybody over 50, y'all sit down. And then, okay, now we're going to sing a hymn. So everybody that doesn't want, y'all can sit. Like, no, we're going to do everything. Like, these are the songs that are foundational to the faith.
Yeah.
And here's something that is being used of God today.
Yeah.
So let's bring all of that together. The line in the Christmas song, kids from 1 to 92. That's what you got on a Sunday morning in that sanctuary.
But you have the divisions in the church, and a lot of this is based on not being discipled. It's not being discipled by the families like you're supposed to be. And when you're in service and you're at worship, we're not worshiping you. We're worshiping God.
Right.
So what we need to be questioning is not, well, I don't really like this tune of that song. Does God like the tune of that song? Does God like the words that you are singing to him?
Oh, we had a lady when I was growing up, Miss Annabelle. She loved to sing. Could not carry a tune in a bucket. But there was nobody who stood on that platform whose heart was more pure when they sang. I mean, anybody. And I remember having a conversation one time after she passed away, and they said, well, she's finally singing on key now. And I was like, I hope not. Because she wouldn't sound like her, if she was on tune.
Right.
And it got to be, I remember when I was leading worship, this is right before I went into college, the pastor, she was a Sunday night singer. He didn't want her singing on Sunday morning. Mm-hmm. And, and I get that as far as, you want to present the best. But again, it just goes back to, she was sincere.
Right.
I mean, it didn't matter. You can put, Sandy Patty or whoever on the platform.
Well, and that's where we've gotten in the church. Sorry.
No, but
go ahead.
Even as off key as she was, you knew her heart was in it, and it was pure praise on her. She was not performing for anybody in that sanctuary.
And see, that's what Sunday morning worship service has turned into, is a performance.
Right.
And I've always taught, like, anytime I would make a youth band and I would put them together and I would teach them, I would always tell them, you want to practice and you want to be good, but not for the purpose of pride, but for the purpose of, giving God your best, number one, but then also limiting distractions.
Oh yeah, and once you trained them up and they got decent, then I would steal them.
Yeah, you sure did. And it's like, what happened to him? I only get him for so long.
That's right. And then Jeremy takes them, puts them on the stage. I said, "Now you graduated. You're in the big league now."
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Go ahead.
Vody Bauckham and like G3 Ministries has a lot of good stuff to say on this. I listen to them a decent amount regarding like family discipleship and education and things like that. But biblically speaking, and it's very clear that discipleship starts in the home, and it's unfortunate that we've gotten to such a point of neglect in that, because we think that raising our kids is just showing them how to tie a hook on a fishing rod and drive a car, keep them out of jail, and all those are good things. But if we're not training them up in the instruction and discipline of the Lord and teaching them that, then what is all the rest of that?
Well, as parents, it is our responsibility, and if you don't feel equipped, talk to your pastor. Your pastor should be able to help you disciple your child,
and they themselves should also be being discipled by their parents or other wise people of the faith.
If everybody was being discipled like the model in the Bible and what Jesus said, more than half of our problems would go away.
And I also think, it's kind of a random thought. I was thinking about it earlier while I was preparing for this. It's often a stereotype to judge a family that may have like 6 or 7 children. I think that's awesome. But hear me out on this. Like, that's a lot of kids. Don't get me wrong. And I'm not putting a number on how many kids you have to have. That's not what I'm saying. If you have 2 kids, that's great. If you don't have any kids, that's great. If you have 100, that's great. But that's the main way of discipleship. If you want to make disciples, make children. Now again,
Literally make disciples.
That also can't neglect making disciples in your workplace and your school and all that stuff.
You don't
that's
want to
what
make
I'm
them
saying.
There.
That's true.
Yeah, you get arrested for that.
That's not what I'm saying. But it is a really beautiful thing to have lots of children that you disciple and raise in the ways of God and in the instruction of His Word. And
our 3 kids, we sit them down and we talk to them about these things. They ask questions and we answer them to the best of our ability. And sometimes, for example, I'm telling you, hey, listen, I've been pastoring kids and youth for 10 years, and my own son wanted to go to the kids pastor. He wanted to ask him some questions, so he privately went with him and talked with him. I have no problem with that. I think it's important that our children talk to someone other than their parents, but their parents need to be the front runner in their discipleship.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And the father, this is kind of a whole other thing, but the role of the father is the spiritual leader of the household.
Leader of the household.
The household.
Leader of the household.
Right. And
doesn't say anything about him being a spiritual leader.
Well, they are the head. They are the headship under the headship of God.
They are the spiritual leader, but they are the leader of their household, period.
Well, yeah, I agree.
Understand?
But I think the spiritual leader is part of that.
Well, it is part of that.
Then
See,
what are you
one
saying?
Neglects the leadership of the household.
Oh, yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
Both.
Okay, yeah, I agree. Yeah. So the father is the leader. And again, we're so quick to, I don't want to get into this, but we're so quick to hire pastors and such when we've never even met their families and we've found out if they are the leaders of their household, because it's very clear that when appointing elders, they have to be the leaders of their household, and
they have to manage their household.
Manage their household. Yeah, you can see that in 1 Timothy 2. So why are we hiring pastors if we have no idea if they're even doing their job in their house? Because their household is before their congregation.
Yep,
absolutely.
And we can hit on that. I can't tell you how many times as a pastor that I was expected to put my family second.
And that's not how it should be.
Now I had pastors that I worked with and worked for that did believe that my family was first. But unfortunately it's very few and far between. Mm-hmm. And then they would also say that, but they wouldn't really mean it. And now we're talking about, just so everybody knows, we're talking about the ideal home. The ideal home, not broken home. You got mom, you got dad, and you got your kids.
And
That's the
there's
ideal.
so many specific scenarios.
I mean,
right.
and we don't have time to jump into this, but what do you do when the father is not leading the household like he should? What do you do?
What if you don't have a father? Like, what if he passed away?
What if the dad is not saved? What if the mom is not
I
saved?
think we touched on that earlier, just briefly.
Sort of. Yeah. Well, and that's where, I'll hit on that again just to emphasize that. Like, if you see other children and their parents have just neglected the faith, they're not Christians, take those children in. Be like Paul. And obviously that you shouldn't just neglect evangelizing to their parents, but take those children in. And
well, Katie's had an excellent opportunity over the past few years to nanny some kids, and it's been a great opportunity for her to try to make a disciple, try to plant those seeds and whatnot. And
Katie, your wife.
Yeah, Katie, my wife. Yeah. Guys, I think that's an excellent conversation. I think we hit a lot of good stuff. I'd encourage some people, go back and listen to the Passover episode, and when we talk with Rabbi, and he talks about some of this family discipleship and it being our responsibility.
I think that's in the second part of the Passover.
It may be.
Yeah, he said one of the things he said was when people ask him if he does small groups, he says, "Yeah, they're called families."
Right.
That is so accurate.
Yeah.
And also listen to the What is a Disciple and Making Disciples that got posted before this.
Don't be discouraged. Ask for help. Just go and start. Listen. The Holy Spirit's got your back. Okay? It's the Holy Spirit that leads, not you. You pray about it and then you lead that child. God's got them. It's okay, but it's our responsibility to lead them to Christ. It's our responsibility to disciple them, not just to lead them to Christ. Listen, it's not okay. I'm going to lead. Oh, my son's saved. Woohoo!
Our house is good.
Check.
We're going to heaven.
Good to go. We're all going to heaven. No, that's the beginning, if anything. Thanks for listening. For more information on DDS Faith Ministries, please visit our website at ddsfaith.org and follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube.